أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم.
So last week, anybody can remind us, what did we cover? What did we go over? Who were here last week?
We were studying istinja last week.
Yeah, istinja last week, almost 2 weeks ago. We just briefly went over tayammum last weig to jog the memory. We covered istinja last week. Anybody can remind us which main parts of istinja, or which parts of istinja did we cover? If anybody can remind us. Okay, yes, what makes istinja fard, which we discussed certain cases, right, where istinja is fard, certain scenarios where it's sunnah. Which scenario was istinja fard did we mention?
The impurity is more than dirham.
Yes, if the impurity spreads more than the size of a dirham, right, then we mentioned that istinja will be fard, right? When will it be sunnat is when it's less than a dirham. Yes, when it's less than a dirham, when the impurity spreads less than a dirham, that's when istinja will be sunnat, not fard, right? And we mentioned certain etiquettes of not only istinja but using the bathroom, right? We discussed when you enter the bathroom, the dua which is recited, it's recited prior to entering the bathroom, not when you're in the bathroom, right? It's prior to entering the bathroom. So you enter with your left foot, and before you enter, you recite the dua, right? Bismillahi, Allahumma inni a'udhu bika min al-khubuthi wal-khaba'ith. It's a short dua. If you haven't memorized it, then you should memorize it. Anytime we use the bathroom, we should recite the dua prior to entering into the bathroom. And we discussed certain etiquettes of when we are in the bathroom, right? We mentioned that we should not be facing towards the qibla, nor should our back be towards the qibla. Sometimes we have a such where the toilet is made where it's facing the qibla. It's not from our own doing, but that's just how it's made. So what should we do in that scenario? We should adjust ourselves in such a way we are not directly facing the qibla, or our back is not directly towards the qibla. We should adjust ourselves. You mentioned the reasoning is because of famous hadith, right? Abu Dawood is mentioned that Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, do not face towards the qibla when you're using the bathroom, nor should you have your back towards the qibla. Due to this, the ulama mentioned that it is actually makruh tahrimi to face the qibla or to have your back towards the qibla when you're in the bathroom. So we should adjust ourselves in such a way where we are not facing it directly, right? It won't be necessary for you to move the entire toilet and position it in such a way where it's not facing the qibla. Our Shaykh al-Hadith in the madrasa, he usually stays here for a couple of months. He goes back and forth, stays here in America for about 2 to 3 months, and then he goes to Bangladesh for about 3-4 months. So he has a certain room that he stays in. So the room that he stayed in, the toilet was made in such a way where it was facing the qibla. So he requested the office, he says, move this toilet. He says, change the toilet because it's facing the qibla. Face it in some other direction. So what can you do? He's Shaykh al-Hadith, he's the teacher of Bukhari, you tell him no. So they said, okay, they complied with his request. They called the people, and they came and they actually took the toilet, moved it from its place and positioned it in such a way where it wasn't facing the qibla. This is just taqwa, so it's not necessary. You could just adjust ourselves in such a way where we're not facing the qibla or our back is not towards the qibla. We mentioned those things which you can do istinja with and certain things which you can't do istinja with, right? If anybody can remind us of some of the things which you can't do istinja with.
You said you can't?
Can't, yes, which you cannot do istinja with. Certain items which istinja is not permissible with, it's not allowed with.
Bones.
Paper, right? Toilet paper is excluded for that because it's made for that specific reason. But paper, for example, bones, droppings,
things of value.
Things of value, right? Any impurities you're using, you cannot use that for istinja.
You said don't use cloth, right?
Yes, cloth cannot be used, right? If it's like a rag, which is just used, for example, like sometimes you have rags laying around the house where you just clean, for example, certain areas that have impurities or whatnot, you could use that. But a cloth, which is not designated for that, you cannot use it for istinja. We mentioned back then, if you look at the books of Fiqh, many of them were written by classical scholars. So at their time, what they would use for istinja would be stones or lumps of clay. Right? So now you have toilet paper, but back then they would use stones or they would use lumps of clay for istinja. Also, when leaving the bathroom, obviously if you're entering with your left foot, then you exit with your right foot and you recite the dua when leaving the bathroom. غفرانك الحمد لله الذي أذهب عني الأذى وعافاني. Right, so these two du'as we should memorize. Also, when you're in the bathroom, it is also one of the etiquettes that you should have your topi on when you're using the bathroom, when you're in the bathroom. Ghazali, I think in Bidayatul Hidayah, he mentioned one of the benefits of this. I can't exactly remember, but he mentions that in a way it actually protects your hair, and if you don't have your topi, it's actually harmful for the hair because of the impurities that you discharge from the body. Some of the whatever it was, something from the impurity or whatever, something, it has some type of acidity, and it's usually something which is airborne and it mixes with the air, and he says that it's actually harmful for your hair. So this is one of the wisdoms of having your topi on when you're in the bathroom, is it can protect your hair from any other harm that can be caused due to the impurities and whatnot. Today we will be covering Najaasat, the types of Najaasat. It'll be brief. I won't go into too much detail. I'll try to cover a little more detail next week, inshallah. Next week we'll go over how to remove impurities. Today we'll just briefly go over the types of Najaasat, how much of it is allowed on your body where salat is valid with it, and how much does it become necessary for you to remove it and to wash it off. So we'll begin with the categorization of Najaasat. What does Najaasat mean? Najaasat means impurity. It's an Arabic word, and it means impurity. So there are two types of Najaasat. Okay, I guess the marker isn't working, but I'll just say it verbally. Okay. There are two types of Najaasat. One is known as Hukmi Najaasat, and one is known as Haqiqi Najaasat. Haqiqi Najaasat is actual impurity, right? That is visible. Hukmi Najaasat is more of being in a state of impurity. It's not an impurity which is visible, right? So again, there's two types of Najaasat. Hukmi, which is being in a state of impurity, it's not an impurity which is visible, and Haqiqi, which is an actual visible impurity. Now each of these, they are categorized into two types. Najaasat al-Hukmi is categorized into two types, and Najaasat al-Haqiqi is also categorized into two types. So Najaasat al-Hukmi, which was what? Which one?
That's like
being in a state of impurity, right?
Okay.
Najaasat al-Hukmi is being in a state of impurity, and this is categorized into two types. This is also of two types. The first one is called Hadith al-Asghar, which literally translates into minor impurity, and Hadith al-Akbar, which literally translates into major impurity. So one is being in a state of minor impurity, and one is being in a state of major impurity. You understand? So there's what? Hukmi Najaasat, Haqiqi Najaasat. Hukmi Najaasat is of two types. Hadith al-Asghar, minor impurity, and Hadith al-Akbar, major impurity. Right? You could just put two types. Hadath Asghar, which literally translates into minor impurity. You could just write minor impurity and major impurity. Right? What is the minor impurity? It is that impurity which necessitates wudu. So for example, if a person breaks his wudu through any one of the actions that break your wudu, that person will be considered to be in a state of Hadath Asghar, minor impurity. And in order to remove that state, what will the person have to do? He will have to perform wudu, right? Hadith al-Asghar, the minor impurity, will be removed through performing wudu. Now what was the second type? The major impurity. The major impurity is something through which ghusl is necessary, right? So if a person, ghusl becomes necessary on him, then the only way for him to remove that major impurity is through performing ghusl. The rulings of the two differ a little bit. So we mentioned there's Najaasat al-Hukmi. Najaasat al-Hukmi is of two types, minor impurity and major impurity. If a person is in the state of minor impurity, he can't pray salat with that, right? Because he has to have wudu to pray salat. But he can recite the Quran verbally. Verbally, to recite the Quran, you don't need to be in a state of wudu. I could just start reciting Quran right now, and I don't have to be in a state of wudu. But I can't touch the Quran without wudu, right? So if a person doesn't have wudu, he can't pray salat, but he can recite the Quran. Now in major impurity, when a person has to perform ghusl, he can't pray salat, nor can he recite Quran. It's not allowed for a person in a state of Hadith Akbar, when he's in a state where ghusl is fard on him, to recite Quran. He cannot recite Quran in that state. So we finished the categorization of Najaasat al-Hukmi, right? First was what? Hadith asghar. The second was which one? Hadith akbar, minor impurity and major impurity. So now we move on to the next one. The next one is Najaasat haqiqi, which is actual visible najasat. So this is also of two types, where you call it ghaliza, heavy impurity, and khafifa, light impurity. So the visible najasat again is categorized into two types, heavy impurity and light impurity. There are certain examples of heavy impurity, right? And the rulings, I'll mention it later on, the rulings for both differ. So heavy impurity, the example of it is blood, that's one. Khamar, right? Pure wine that's made from grapes. That's also an example of something which is impure, right? The meat of a carcass of an animal which was not slaughtered according to the rulings of Sharia, right? The meat of that animal, it's impure. Also, the skin of that animal is impure as well, right? If it's not slaughtered according to the Islamic method, then the meat and skin of that animal is considered to be impure, and that's also, it's a heavy impurity.
So even like carrion and stuff.
Yes, carrion.
So if you touch roadkill, that means that you would then have to take ghusl.
No, you don't have to take ghusl. We'll discuss that you have to wash that off. Right? We want to mention there's certain amounts through which your salat is still valid if that amount is on your body. Right? So also we mentioned the urine of animals which are not permissible to eat. There's certain animals which are not permissible to eat. So the urine of those animals falls under this category, where it's a heavy impurity. Right? The saliva of dogs is also a heavy impurity. So what is the ruling in regards to this heavy impurity? What if it gets on your body or if it gets on your clothing? If it is less than the size of a dirham, which we mentioned, how big is a dirham? 50 cent coin, right? It's like the size of a 50 cent coin. If it is less than that amount, then your salat will be valid. But if it is equal to or more than that amount, then your salat will not be valid. You have to wash it off. So if a dog, for example, licks my clothes and it's more than the size of a dirham, of a 50 cent coin, I will not be able to pray salat in this pair of clothing. I'll have to wash it off.
Whether it's on your skin or your...
Whether it's on the skin or whether it's on the clothing, I have to wash it off. I cannot pray salat with this on my body. Similarly is the case with blood, right? Similarly, just how is the saliva of dogs, there's saliva of predatory animals, animals that eat other animals. Their saliva is also considered to be najasat ghaliza, a heavy type of impurity, right? Pig, of course, it's clearly mentioned in the Quran. Any part of the pig is impure. It's considered to be a heavy impurity, right? And also the feces, the droppings of every type of animal is also considered to be a heavy impurity, right? Najaasat ghaliza. The second type, the first one was heavy impurity. And we mentioned the ruling in regards to heavy impurity. What if it gets on your clothes or your body?
If it's less than a dirham, then
If it's less than a dirham, then salat will be valid, but you should still wash it off. If it's more, you'll have to wash it off, and you can't pray salat without it, with it on your body. Second is najasat khafifa, a light type of impurity. Right? What are examples of a light type of impurity? The urine of animals which are permissible to eat. So, for example, like sheep, goat, cows. If urine of these animals gets on your clothes, then that's going to be considered a light impurity, right?
Even if it is more than that,
Yeah, I'll mention the amount. So the amount, how much of this is forgiven, it's mentioned that if it's less than a quarter of the limb or a quarter of the clothing, then salat will be valid. So say, for example, a urine of a cow gets on my sleeve. If it's less than a quarter of my sleeve, then I can pray salat in it with it. But if I say, for example, this much of my sleeve, there's cow urine on it, will I be able to pray salat in this? No, it's more than a quarter of the sleeve. Similarly, if one panel of the shirt, some urine gets on it, some light type of impurity gets on it, if it is less than a quarter of that panel of clothing, then my salat will be valid with it. Similarly, on a limb as well. For example, if on my leg some urine gets on it or some light impurity gets on it, if it's less than a quarter of it, I can pray salat. If it's more, I have to wash it off, right? The hand.
Just that section of clothing, or the like?
Not the entire clothing. I mentioned, like, for example, if it's a sleeve, then we will consider a clothing a quarter of the sleeve. If it's like a panel of the shirt that you're wearing, then a quarter of that. If it gets to that amount or more than that, then you'll have to wash it off. Yes.
I mean, sometimes it could be like different. Like the urine could be like spread out, but it's like in small drops. Like you can have a drop here and then like a small drop there.
You'll add it up if you, based on your own judgment. If you say if they were all gathered in one place, would it be more than a quarter of this portion of the clothing or not? If you think it's more, then you'll have to wash it off. If you think that it's less, then you won't have to wash it off. Less. Understand?
How about the smell?
Huh?
The smell.
The smell. Oh, we'll get to that. How to remove the impurities. We mentioned that if it's a visible impurity, if it's something, for example, like feces or urine. Oh no, sorry, not urine, feces, for example. Something which stays visible and it has a body, and it's an impurity. If it gets on the clothing, for example, it'll be sufficient for you to just remove it from the clothing. There's no certain amount of times which you'll have to wash it, right? Just as long as you're sure that it is removed from the clothing. So for example, there's feces that get on my clothing. I can remove that, and even if after removing it, there's still some type of stain that remains there, or there's still some type of smell that remains there, it won't be necessary for me to now use some type of soap to remove that stain. The impurity will be considered to be removed. That's when it's something which is, you could say it has a body. Now what if it's something which is like urine, for example? Then in that scenario, you will wash it until the effect of it is removed. Usually the scholars say that is done by washing it 3 times. So you wash it once, and then you wring the cloth. You keep wringing it until all of the drops of water fall out of it. And then again, you'll wash it a second time, and again you'll wring it. And the third time you'll wash it, and you'll wring it the third time, right? So this is in regards to those which don't have a body. Like urine, for example, or you could say like even blood, for example. You'll wash it 3 times. And you'll wring the cloth after each time washing it. So the question comes that what if it's something which can be wringed, like what if it's a carpet? There's some impurity that falls on the carpet. So in that case, what you will do is you estimate, for example, say that stain over here. Say, for example, if, hypothetically speaking, if that were to be an impurity. So what you would do is you would take water equal to the size of that stain, and you would pour it on the area. So you would pour water on this area where that stain is, and you will wait for it to dry. After it dries, you will pour it again a second time. You wait for it to dry. After that, you'll pour it again a third time, and you'll wait for it to dry. After doing it 3 times, and the area will be considered to be purified. The impurity will be considered to be gone. That's how to purify it. Again, if it's something which is visible and it has a body, you can just remove it, right? Remove it from the clothing that it fell on. If it doesn't have a body, like urine, for example, then you will wash it 3 times. After each time of washing, you will wring the cloth. Does that clear everything up? So that'll be all for today. Inshallah, anybody have any questions in regards to this? Yes?
So you know, you said for the clothes, like if there's urine on it, you wash 3 times. So say for example, what if like when you were going to get some water, the impurity dries up, and now like you forgot like where it was exactly. What would you do in that case?
Again, you would make, based on your judgment, you would according to your judgment where you think that it was, and you will wash that specific part. If you have doubt or like which part is it, there are many parts, then what you could do is whichever area, if there's a whole certain area but you can't pinpoint exactly which area it is, you can just wash that entire area. So say for example, I know that urine fell somewhere on the bottom half of this part of my cloth, but I'm not sure which. So to remove any doubt, you will just wash the entire bottom half 3 times. To remove any doubt.
You said for hukmi Najaasat, for the major, there's no salah or Quran reading verbally, and
Yes.
for the asghar, you can do salah. You can't do salah, but you could read the Quran verbally but not touch it.
Yes, the minor impurities.
So what about dhikr? Like someone says astaghfirullah.
Dhikr you could do.
So I can do dhikr in both hukmi.
Yes.
Asghar and
Hadith of Aisha radiallahu anha, that Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam would do dhikr of Allah in every condition that he was in. Even if it was in the condition of Hadith Akbar, Rasulullah would do dhikr. Yes.
So if you need to make wudu, can you still like, for example, touch the Quran like with a stick or something, like to flip the pages?
Yeah, that's fine. Again, as long as it's not something which is attached to the body. For example, if you put on a glove and you touch the Quran with that, the scholars say that's makruh, that's disliked, right? Because that's something which is, you could say, technically attached to the body, right? A way where you can differentiate between whether or not it is or isn't is that it can easily be removed if you just pick it up, or you could just like if you just pick it up and with ease it can be removed. Say for example, if I use the sleeve of my shirt and I hold the Quran, that'll be makruh because it's something which is technically it's attached to me, right? But now if I take, for example, a paper towel and I use a paper towel and I hold the Quran with that, that'll be allowed because the paper towel technically is not attached to me, right? So that'll be the ruling in regards to that. Any other questions about this?
Human urine is.
No, that's also
That's a major impurity, right?
I forgot to mention that, yes.
Can you give more examples for Najaasat Khafifa?
Najaasat al-Khafif, what did I mention? Urine of animals that you can eat, right?
Also-
Birds, besides there are certain birds that are excluded. Ducks, wild ducks, and fowls. Fowls. Besides these three, the urine of the rest of the birds is considered to be a light impurity.
So predatory birds, their bird droppings are a minor impurity,
Minor impurity,
right? Like falcons and hawks and
yes.
basically any bird that we cannot eat, like a pigeon or something like that.
Yes, that will be considered to be a light impurity. Yes.
Also, just when you mentioned about washing a piece or a part of the thing, the definition for washing is basically water flowing out of it, not necessarily a whole bucket or anything like that. It's just enough for the water to be flowing. Like you said, when blood is flowing, it's just like water on top of it is considered wash. You don't have to drink the whole.
Such an amount where if you wring it, then water drops will come out of it. Any other questions, brothers?
So removing the impurities will be another topic or?
I'll cover that in more detail next week, inshallah. There's a couple more things that can be covered in regards to that aspect. Any other questions? Inshallah, jazakallah khair. Reward you brothers taking out your time. Subhanallah wa bihamdihi, subhanallah wa bihamdihi, ashhadu an la ilaha illa anta, astaghfiruka.